I did not ever want to make a video like this. Generally, when I talk about queer issues on this channel, even when I directly confront the underlying politics, I do it through the lens of geeky media, or at the very least, I somehow tie it into things that I've addressed in the past that are in that vein. That is not going to be the case here. No geeky tie-in, no angle, just the straightforward situation. Depending on who you interact with in your life or online, you may have already heard the term transgenocide, but it could just as easily be a new term to you. It's one that's seeing an increased use amongst trans people and their allies for what is currently being done by government entities to the trans community at large. And there's a very good chance that the phrase strikes you as hyperbolic. I mean, trans people aren't being herded into camps. They aren't being exterminated by the government. You may also find yourself asking, doesn't using a word like genocide to refer to a few pieces of legislation in a few states kind of dilute the power of that word? It's also possible you're wary of the term because the last time a term with genocide in it started to see any kind of wide use in this country, it was a few years back with white genocide, a bunk conspiracy narrative that postulated non-whites were going to breed white people out of existence, or at the very least out of being the demographic majority in the US and similar nations. It was rooted in classic white nationalist rhetoric, and yes, that instance absolutely did dilute the meaning of the word genocide, but I also kind of suspect that that's part of why the concept didn't really fully latch on in the mainstream and has since had to be rebranded as the Great Replacement. For these and possibly other reasons, you may have been tilting your head or giving a little bit of side eye to the term transgenocide. The intended audience for this video are people who have no open hostility towards the trans community, but who may think that trans activists are kind of going overboard with how they talk about just a couple of laws in a few places. This video is not addressed to anyone who already believes that trans people are actually dangerous, are a threat to women by their presence, are inherently predatory, or are looking to convert minors. I frankly don't know how to address those people, nor is it really safe for me to attempt to do so. If you already consider yourself an ally, or you yourself are trans, you may also find this video helpful in terms of using the information that is within it to help you better articulate to others what it is that has been going on. And while I could try and take a more complete view of the scope of things and talk about what's going on in places such as Uganda, where the parliament there passed a bill that criminalizes identifying as literally anything other than heterosexual and cisgender, which did in fact happen while I was working on the script for this video. But I know that ultimately most of my audience is in the US, and it's a common instinct to see what's happening in other countries and to assume that won't happen here. So I will be limiting my talking points and specific examples and citations to things that have taken place within the United States. Moreover, nearly every example that I am going to cite are going to be ones that have come about in the year 2023. This is not to minimize the horrible things occurring around the world or to ignore what has happened in years prior, but simply to grant this specific video a narrower focus for the sake of clarity with the intended audience. I'm going to do my best to talk simply and plainly. I do not intend to raise my voice. I hope to avoid hypotheticals and what-if scenarios. I'm not going to get into the recently gained insight about who is forming these laws and how they have been going about it. And I do not intend to single out any specific individuals by name, be they politicians, public figures, or other creators. It is my hope to deal with very simple facts that should not be in dispute. And with all that established, the question I hope to address is this: does what is happening to trans people across the US constitute the use of the word genocide? Now, firstly, we're going to have to actually define genocide, because to look at how the term is used and reacted to in the US, we appear to actually have a bit of a skewed idea of what actually constitutes a genocide. This is likely owing to the fact that most Americans are only really ever taught about one genocide in their time at school, and that being, naturally, the Holocaust. American students are rarely, if ever, taught about the genocides that took place between World War II and the present in places such as Myanmar, Darfur, the Democratic Republic of Congo, India, Cambodia, Algeria, and many others. American schools may teach a limited amount about the native and indigenous people displaced by colonialization and expansion of the United States, but it will virtually never be identified as what it was, which was genocide. And when Americans think about genocide, they think Nazis. They think concentration camps. They think showers where people were gassed to death en masse. And while the Holocaust was a genocide, it was not the only form that genocide can take. This is extremely important to understand because otherwise it narrows the view of what genocide even is. And if you're worried I might be trying to redefine the term to include more things, allow me to provide you the 5 acts that constitute genocide against a group as adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. 1. Killing members of the group. 2. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. 4. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. 5. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We're going to go over these points and look at them through the lens of what legislation has either already been passed or been proposed within the United States. However, I am going to make some concessions and some clarifications. As currently defined by the UN and international criminal courts, genocide is taken against national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. For the purposes of potential prosecution by the international criminal courts, groups such as sex, gender, or sexual orientation aren't currently included. But that's only the strictest legal definition, and there have been attempts to amend this. I'm acknowledging this because if I don't, I know I'll be accused of manipulating facts by omission. However, I'm going to suggest to you that a group of people being subjected to any of those 5 activities for things they cannot change about themselves, such as being gay or transgender or intersex, should be viewed as that group being the target of genocide as a practical matter, even if it is not considered to be that as a matter of law. If you're not willing to go that far, then at least I hope you'll accept that the qualifier of trans in the term transgenocide is making clear what group these actions are being taken against and makes it a potentially accurate descriptor if these 5 actions can be demonstrated as being taken against trans people. So, can they be demonstrated? Well, let's go through the points I listed. First, there is the most obvious act, killing members of the group. Again, this is what most Americans will think of when they think genocide. And at present, while there is a great deal of violent rhetoric these days, in this country at least, there is no proposed legislation which would impose the threat of death upon trans people for being trans. We could get into how the legislation that is in play promotes and empowers general hostility and creates a climate that encourages more and more people to take violent action against people who are trans, and the statistics bear out that this is already occurring. But since it's not actually being proposed legislatively, for the sake of clarity and to avoid muddying the waters, we will set the act of killing members of the group aside. The other one we can set aside at this time is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. There are, at present, no proposals that I am aware of that push for the sterilization of trans people. And there likely won't be, due to a somewhat unique quirk of the situation. While trans men and non-binary people with uteruses are by no means safe in the current climate, the focus of legislative measures, as well as rhetoric against trans people, has focused very heavily on trans women. The most common medical aid to transition from a masculine to a feminine state for trans women is through hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. and it often takes less than a year on HRT for a person assigned male at birth to be rendered infertile. Now, trans men and non-binary people with uteruses are still quite capable of bearing children, but again, they are rarely singled out and thus far haven't been in these proposed laws, so far as I am aware. As with the act of killing group members, there are things that could muddy these waters, such as restricting the ability of trans people to adopt, or attempts to deny trans people the right to marry, and of course the crossover with the current attack on reproductive rights in general in this country. But, as before, we shall set this one aside. That leaves us with 3 remaining acts that constitute genocide. And before I start addressing those, I want to point out and make clear something that is very, very important to understand. To meet the criteria of genocide, it does not require that all of these acts be committed against a group. It requires that only one be committed. It's not a checklist. You don't have to do them all. Also, I'll remind you that the acts need not be taken against the entirety of the group, but merely against members of the group for the strict reason that they are members of that group. So, the fact that much of what I'm going to be talking about is specifically targeting only portions of the trans community, often trans youth, and is doing so in only a limited number of states at this time, an applicable act would still qualify as an act of genocide against the group as a whole. From here out, I'm going to start citing specific laws either proposed or passed. I will not be able to be anything close to comprehensive about this, both because there is an ongoing flood of these, and any attempt at a complete list would be out of date as soon as it was uploaded, and also because there's been nearly 400 bills targeting LGBTQIA plus people in general, or trans people in specific, since the start of 2023. I will cite specific bills and the states in which they have been proposed or enacted, and you can certainly look them up for yourself to be sure that I have not distorted them. But understand that for as many specific ones as I give, there will be dozens, if not hundreds, of comparable proposed bills in other states. It's possible that some of these will not pass, or may even have been defeated by the time this video is live to the public. But the very fact that they were proposed and debated in state legislatures makes them relevant to the discussion regardless, because it is illustrative of the intent of those pushing these bills and the current climate in which they are being put forward. So, let us get back to our remaining 3 acts of genocide and address causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 2 relevant laws to bring up around an act such as this would include Georgia Senate Bill 140 and South Dakota House Bill 1080, both of which ban gender-affirming medical treatment for trans youth. It's worth noting that these bills do not ban any specific treatment or medication in and of itself. Rather, they ban their use strictly for the purposes of gender affirmation. So if, say, a minor is diagnosed with central precocious puberty, they may be prescribed leuprolide acetate to slow development. But a minor cannot be prescribed the same medication to delay or prevent the onset of a puberty they do not desire, because it would force them into an identity they don't have. No matter the wishes of those children, their parents, or the advice of any medical professionals treating them, they will not be prescribed those medications for that purpose. This creates a situation where trans youth who know that they are trans and know that they are not the gender they were assigned at birth will be given no option but to undergo a puberty into a body they do not want, do not identify with, and will cause potentially severe dysphoria, resulting in both mental distress and physical traumatic changes, the ramifications of which will be that those youths will try and undo that with HRT once they are legally adults, at least in some states, because there are laws like Oklahoma Senate Bill 129, which renders illegal any gender-affirming care for trans individuals until they are 26 years of age. This strips not only minors, but legal adults of the rights to seek medical assistance in affirming their gender identity and would cause any adult under 26 currently on a hormone regimen in that state to be denied those treatments until they, quote unquote, come of age, resulting in potentially traumatizing forced detransition. Forcing trans people to remain in or return to a life, a body, and a hormone balance that causes them physical, emotional, and mental distress fits very cleanly into causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group. Now, next we have deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. This one, admittedly, is going to be slightly more interpretive on my part than the last one due to the inclusion of intent in its wording. And intent is something which can be disputed unless I go down the rabbit hole of the specific people bringing these laws forward, and I said I was not going to do that. But I feel that enough of these laws at least brush up against this act that it warrants discussion, even if it's the least clear-cut instance that I will be addressing going forward. This is where we can bring up Tennessee Senate Bill 3, otherwise known as the Anti-Drag Bill. Officially, the bill classifies male or female impersonators as adult cabaret entertainers, grouping them in with strippers and exotic dancers, and bans them from performing in any space where a minor might see them. In other words, any public space. This practically functions as a ban on pride celebrations, but it's the vagueness of the wording that enables it to be wielded against trans people, even though they are not specifically cited. The bill does not define male or female impersonator, and since Tennessee does not allow for the changing of gender markers on birth certificates, it will be possible for a legal argument to be made that any trans person is in fact a male or female impersonator, since the state does not fully recognize that they are no longer the gender that they were assigned at birth. The bill also fails to define what a performance is, leaving any individuals enforcing the law to decide if someone they believe to be a male or female impersonator is giving a performance. The practical upshot of the bill creates a legally fragile situation for any trans person to simply be out in public in the state of Tennessee. The vagueness creates so much uncertainty for trans people that the safest option is for them to flee the state, not leave their homes, or detransition, in part or in full. Conditions of life have been altered to suppress, restrict, and terrify trans people into invisibility and compliance. And while I can't speak to the specific intent of those who brought forth and passed this law, I feel, at the very least, it warrants consideration of matching the act of inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part. Finally, there is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And this one, we are back to extremely straightforward examples. Earlier this year in Florida, Senate Bill 254 was introduced. In its current form, this law would classify any gender-affirming care granted to a minor as unjustifiable conduct and serious physical harm. It grants jurisdiction of the child to the state, which would empower state agents to remove a trans minor from their home and family. It would also attempt to usurp parental rights in other states, laying out specifically that the court should not treat as criminal the removal of a child from one parent by the other parent, even if it involves bringing a child across state lines, if the removal was done to prevent gender-affirming care. The practical upshot of this would mean that if a couple is divorced or unwed, and one parent has full custody of their child, and that child is trans, the parent with no custody rights will be protected if they kidnap the trans child and claim they did so to protect them from trans-affirming care. The law specifically lays out that this would be the case even if the parent with custody resides outside the state of Florida, and it does not even require that trans-affirming care be currently being provided. It is only necessary that there is a belief that a youth is at risk of receiving gender-affirming care. And that is true of the entire bill. There need only be a suspicion that a child is at risk of being supported and receiving affirming care for the state to either remove that child themselves or look the other way as a non-custodial parent does it. And while the bill is targeted at trans youth, the broadness of at risk could also put transgender parents under legal scrutiny as well, as it would be very straightforward to argue that if a parent is trans, they would be trans-affirming to their children if those children ever took on a trans identity, and thus those children are at risk. To show that this is not a one-off proposal or some kind of fluke unique to Florida, I am going to briefly step outside of legislation as well as the current year to touch instead on the directives of governors. While a governor cannot pass laws on their own, they can direct the priorities and adjust the guidelines of many state agencies. And in 2022, as a governor's directive, the Texas Department of Family Protective Services was instructed to consider parents and families supportive of trans youth to be engaging in child abuse and to investigate them on that basis. And while this is currently being fought in court, the natural outcome of such an investigation, when simply being supportive of a minor's transition alone is considered abuse, is to remove that minor from their family and force them into the foster care system. These are laws and directives that simply and plainly attempt to remove trans youth from affirming and supportive parents, and in some interpretations opens the door to even cisgender children being removed from the homes of trans parents. Children would be forcibly removed from the group and transferred to another group. And I'd like to add an additional thought here in case anyone is thinking to themselves, well, many of these trans kids don't live with trans parents, so are they really being taken away from that group? I would argue that in the case of being transgender, that the parents not being trans themselves does not matter, and that them being trans affirming essentially makes it all the same function. The reason in the case of a national or religious group to remove the children from the homes and take them away from those groups and put them in another group is to ensure that they do not be raised in that state and with those people and affirming those beliefs, nationalities, etc. Removing trans children from affirming parents serves the exact same purpose even if those parents themselves are not trans. So there we have it. 3 criteria that are either already being met or are being approached by proposed or already enacted legislation. So to answer the core question in all of this, is what is happening in the U.S. to trans people a form of genocide? Yes. These laws and directives, and many that I haven't even spoken about, both individually and collectively, are an attempt to commit genocide against trans people. I deeply hope that I have demonstrated that. And there are some states attempting to go in the other direction, such as Minnesota, with the proposed bill HF 146, which would make the state a refuge for those fleeing prosecution for being trans in other states. In Canada, while it is, in fact, already permitted for people to seek asylum to flee persecution on the basis of gender identity or sexuality, there is a groundswell of support for a petition to strengthen and fully codify those guidelines in the face of what is happening in the U.S. But understand that these actions do not balance out. While some areas strengthening protections is certainly welcome, so many have already enacted appalling restrictions on existing as a trans person. And leading Republican candidate for president, Donald Trump, who is the only person I'm going to mention by name, has already stated his intention to strip support for transgender people as part of his official election platform. Right now, it is localized to certain states, but it can become a national crisis on the results of a single election. But truly, the fact that it could get worse shouldn't be necessary to point out, because it's already gone farther than it ever should have been allowed. There are lots of points I could make. I could bring up that other groups that these same tactics could be used against, such as cisgender gays and lesbians, are going to be at risk soon if they're not already. I could point out the parallels between what we've already seen happen in other genocides around the world, historical and current. I could bring up the fact that an invited speaker at one of the most influential conservative events in the country called for the, quote, eradication of transgenderism, and that statement was met with applause. But I shouldn't have to, because we're already in an active genocide attempt right now, not in the future, not down the line, right this instant. And if the government doesn't round up and exterminate trans people, know that trans people are dying because of these actions anyway. Their quality of life is dropping. They are being excluded from public life. And people who hate us feel empowered to assault and kill us because everything about this tells them that we are less than human, and they do not have to think of us as deserving of anything, not even our own lives. At the end of 2022, the Human Rights Campaign noted an epidemic of violence against trans people. Last year, 34 trans people were killed, not died, were killed. And this year so far, there have been 6 that we know of. And those may not seem like big numbers to you, but I want you to hear their names, because they weren't statistics. They were people. They were Amarie Leigh, Duval Princess, Cypress Ramos, Naomi Skinner, Matthew Angelo Spampanato, Paloma Vasquez, Tatiana LaBelle, Catherine Katie Newhouse, Kenyatta Kesha Webster, Mia Love Parker, Ariana Mitchell, Fern Feather, Ray Muscat, Nedra Sequence Morris, Shanalika Iela Dior Hemingway, Sasha Mason, Brazil Johnson, Chaminade Giselle Marie, Kitty Monroe, Martasia Richmond, Keshia Chanel Getter, Cherry Bush, Maricela Castro, Hayden Davis, Candy Red, Aaron Lynch, Maddie Hoffman, Dee Dee Ricks, Maya Allen, A.C. Morrison, Samaj Billingsley, Tiffany Banks, Daniel Ashton, Kelly Loving, Tortuguita, Chashay Henderson, Maria Jose Rivera, Sachi Imanitwitahu, Unique Banks, Casey Johnson, Jasmine Starr Mack. These names don't even begin to address the issue of suicide, a growing concern for many trans people, especially trans youth, as the future they saw for themselves is ripped away from them, and the only future they can see is one in which they are forced to live a life that brings them pain because it's simply not who they are. And when faced with that future, some will opt out, by whatever means they feel are necessary. We have already seen this play out this year with Eden Knight, a trans college student isolated by American fixers who returned her to Saudi Arabia, where she was forcibly detransitioned and chose to end her own life. What we are seeing happen in the United States will only result in more deaths. And the people proposing and passing these laws know this. They have been told. They have been told by community members, parents, medical professionals, trans youth themselves. They are not ignorant of the deaths that will occur, and yet they moved forward because they see the lives of trans people as an acceptable price to pay. And that is me being generous, because the alternative is that these deaths are actually the desired outcome. If you live in a state where these laws have been proposed, please call your congressperson. Please make your voice heard. Please contact local LGBTQIA plus supportive groups and find out what they need in order to do the most good in your area. If you live in an area currently considered safe, as I do, then please consider donating or supporting in any way you can any of the following organizations: the Trevor Project, Trans Lifeline, Human Rights Campaign Foundation, and the National Center for Trans Equality. There are other organizations as well. I encourage you to seek out other recommendations, but these are places to start. It feels gross to do my usual self-promotion at the end of this. You can look down in the description of this video if you are interested in any of my other works or ways to support me. As I said at the start, I didn't want to make this. Ever. I want to talk about geeky nonsense and get hyped for Doctor Who. I don't want to be an advocate. I truly do not. But in a situation like this, what I want is the wrong perspective. This is what I can do, and I need to do it. If you've gotten to the end of this video, then I will say to you now, as I always have, that no matter what else is going on in this country or the world right now, I need you to remember you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. Please take care out there of yourself and of those around you. Be well, be safe, and be kind